So,
We're back
once
again.
again.
I'm actually drinking Argentinian wine, so I'll wet my throat again.
¿Cómo ingresaste en el mundo del cómic?
Well, I went to our college and I met a number of like-minded people in our college who loved the underground press, you know, the alternative press for comics, and we were getting a lot of European comics. We were getting Metal Holland, which you might know, so like features some of the best artists in the world, Mobius and people like that. So I was reintroduced to comics when I went to our college because a number of people had stuck with it. I was like quite a late developer. I went back to, I did a lot of things in my life before I went to our college. So some of the people I met were a little bit younger than me, and they started to reintroduce me to comics and the sort of graphic storytelling that I've grown to love and become involved in. So going to our college was the very first thing that reintroduced me to my love of comics, and seeing how mature comics and mature stories could be told in the picture form with, you know, word balloons and sound effects. That's the sort of stuff that reawakened my interest. And plus the fact I was really interested in anatomy, you know, the drawing of the figure and the way the body works. So to see how beautiful some comic artists were, the way they used anatomy, people like Neil Adams and Mobius, Jean Giraud and people like that, I needed to get involved in something where I could draw the human figure. So our college was the very first reintroduction to me for the sort of comics I wanted to do.
Bien. ¿Cómo ingresaste a Watchmen y cuál fue el origen de ese cómic?
Once I left art college, I wanted to get into science fiction book cover illustration. Science fiction is the thing that I love most. I still love science fiction stories and novels and comics and literature. Science fiction is the thing I love most. And when I left art college, I needed to find a job in London, which was the centre of book publishing in the UK at that particular time. Now with the internet, we can travel the world. We can talk to people in America, people in Argentina, people in Brazil, people in France. But in those days, I had to go into the offices to show people my portfolio. So I got a job in London, and when I had weekends off, or when I did sort of like had lunchtime, I used to go to the publishers, the science fiction book publishers in London, who were based in London, and I used to show them my portfolio. And you start meeting people of a similar mindset. You know, you go to Comic Cons or you go to science fiction comic like literature meetings and all that sort of stuff. So that's the type of stuff that coming into London opened my eyes to the whole new network of people to talk to and to mix with. And because at that particular time when I first came to London, 2000 AD, which for me is still one of the greatest science fiction comics in the whole world, and I tend to read a lot of science fiction from wherever it comes from, but I'm still working for 2000 AD now. So that's a very, very long time, for someone or one particular publication to keep producing work. So I was starting to apply to 2000 AD to start doing science fiction comics and storytelling. So it's all started to get, once I moved to London, things started to roll and things started to get really interesting for me.
Bien. Watchmen tiene la novedad de que la página está dividida en 9 viñetas. ¿Cómo fue trabajar así? ¿Y por qué hacer la página de esa manera?
The great thing for me is sort of like, as I said, once I came to London, I started meeting people of a similar mindset, people who love science fiction, love fantasy, loved horror, love superhero comics. And because the people I were meeting, like Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons and Brian Bolland and Steve Dillon, all the people that I really admired. We were developing all at the same time. Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore were Dave probably started a couple of years before I did. Alan Moore more or less started writing around the same time that I started producing comic strip work. So I was actually working with Alan Moore for 2000 AD before Watchmen was even thought about. So that was probably about 5-6 years, probably, yeah, 2 or 3 years before Watchmen actually was created in the mind of Alan and Dave Gibbons. So I was doing work with Alan Moore. He was writing stuff for 2000 AD. So I was working with Alan Moore on stories, and I was drawing them. And Alan always had an incredibly strong visual idea of what he wanted to see in his comic strip. And so right from the very early days, you know, when I was doing the stories for Alan, he knew every single thing he wanted to appear in each panel. He knew what the background was going to look like, what the foreground was going to look like. And there was definitely a sense of he had an idea in his mind of how to explain the story from the very first panel to the very last panel. It's the way that DC Comics tends to write their full scripts, whereas Marvel, as you probably know, it's like they do a synopsis and then the artist breaks down the story into visual panels. But Alan knew very, very early on, and once he started talking to the artist, which obviously is Dave Gibbons, they wanted to have something that was going to be very cinematic. So it really was, things was like completely and utterly defined, you know, all the way down the page. And that was the great thing about like working with Dave, because Dave, as the artist, had such a precise mindset. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. And obviously because Alan is the genius that he is about storytelling, when he gave Dave the idea of, or told him the story, and they defined every single aspect right from the very, very beginning, right to the end, how it was going to unfold. So the 9-panel grid was such a restrictive, you know, storytelling element to a certain extent. To a lot of people, it would have been almost impossible to do. But because Dave is such an incredible artist, he made each panel work. So you got the close-up, the long shot, behind the shoulder shot and everything. And Dave made it work in such an incredible way. For me as the colorist, it was very satisfying to work with Dave Gibbons' artwork, because Dave would like do backlighting, so I could come in from behind with a different color, and I could use a complementary color from the front. So that's because of how brilliant an artist Dave Gibbons is. So working within that 9-panel grid, you know, for me was very, very easy. You know, Dave was the one who had to make the script work. So yeah, I didn't have a problem with it.
En el número 5, Aterradora Simetría, tanto color como guión como dibujo es un reflejo simétrico del primero con el último número, y así llegar al centro. ¿Qué es lo que le pidió Alan ahí y qué es lo que querían transmitir?
Yeah, I mean, I think because of the way Alan had told the story, I think with all the flashbacks, I think the great thing for me as the colorist was, and with complete and utter support from Dave Gibbons, you know, the great thing about like dealing with Dave and Alan was, you know, they think outside the box. So they think outside that box. They think sort of like, you know, Alan had certain scenes where he wanted a certain color combination, with Morlock, when Rorschach goes to Morlock's apartment and they have the flashing neon lights. And so it goes light, dark, light, dark. And so Alan had ideas. He didn't have color ideas all the way through, but he had ideas of certain scenes. And Dave was exactly the same. He had ideas of what he wanted the costumes of the characters to look like. He had ideas of what he wanted certain scenes to be, such as, you know, the flashback, particularly the violent scenes and the use of red and orange for violence was something I introduced in the context. It gave it a sense of going back and reintroducing it when we went to flashback throughout the whole 12 issues. So I love the fearful symmetry word. I think it's a lovely phrase. I think the idea is like David Allen always wants to make sure there was a circular thing to it. I mean, everyone talks about life as a circle. You know, you start off and then you end up in the same place, more or less. And that was the great thing about, you know, the sheer artistic genius of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. They wanted it to be symmetrical. They wanted things to like start in the beginning and then come back to it at the end. And that was, for me, was like, I need, to a certain extent, I need limitations of what I'm trying to do with the colour. And working with David and Alan, that was for me, was a perfect collaboration.
Perfecto. ¿Por qué crees que Watchmen fue un antes y después en la industria del cómic?
I think for me, almost to a certain extent, I grabbed hold and went along for the wild ride. For me, creatively, Watchmen was something that's like, it was probably the very first year, 1986, when it came out, was probably the very first year that I actually made a living as a comic artist, you know, doing lots of other things, but comics became my my income and my life, my sort of like, this is what I love most doing. I still love today sitting down in the studio and drawing and being paid to draw. So for me, so like Watchmen was something that, well, I didn't have a career before Watchmen, and I obviously had a very long career after Watchmen, but it was a pinnacle for me in my career that I dream and aspire to reach again. Before Watchmen, for the comics world, I mean, I think you could talk about other creators like Frank Miller and Greg Sims, Dave Sims, Cerebus. I mean, people like that were starting to do something different within mainstream comics. As I said earlier, for me, the Undergrounds was a reintroduction into what could be done within the comics medium. For me, sort of like to have that maturity in mainstream comics, I don't think anyone had treated it in the way that Alan Moore treated writing comics. And Alan brought into mainstream comics. And that's, no matter how many negatives some people might throw at DC Comics, DC Comics took mainstream comics and made it work for the world. They introduced maturity into mainstream comics. And they even, Dark Horse, for me, I love Dark Horse comics because they were slightly outside mainstream. I mean, I know to a certain extent you could debate whether or not they're mainstream or not. But the great thing about sort of like what was happening at that particular time was you got creators coming into comics that might have gone elsewhere. They might have gone to Hollywood, they might have gone into book publishing, they might have gone to literature. But they decided there was something about the comics medium that suited them. So for me, so like, you know, Watchmen was something, it was definitely a benchmark. It's definitely a starting point for a lot of things that came after. I mean, you could say Mark Millar, you know, so like the great Scottish writer. I mean, he is doing stuff that would not have happened without Watchmen as a, you know, the foundation basically, you know. And I don't think anyone else. No, I think you're right. I think Watchmen really was the starting point for a lot of things in mainstream comics that's come after.
Perfecto. ¿Cómo ingresaste a The Killing Joke y cómo nació ese cómic en el que en el que un villano tiene el final el origen más dramático que puede tener, que es el del hombre ordinario y derrotado.
I think to a certain extent I follow the script. Well, to a complete extent. I mean, I follow the script. I mean, the great thing for me was sort of like talking to Alan and Dave. I mean, when I first got involved with, one of the things I love most about what I do is the collaboration. I love the fact that three people can come together, so like, you know, the writer, the artist, the colorist, and we can say the letterer, you know, the editor. I mean, it's a collaboration. There's many, many people who make that one particular story works. And the great thing about someone like Alan Moore was the fact that, one, he's talented, but he also connects with people. His scripts, I'm assuming you've seen his written scripts, and they're always very, very entertaining anyway. So to actually break boundaries the way that Alan did as a writer, and to introduce things, emotions and relationships that were very, very mature, that hadn't really appeared in superhero comics, certainly at that particular time. They might have appeared in romance comics, or I don't know if you remember or you know comics history of EC Comics. You know, EC Comics were approaching horror and science fiction romance in a very mature way. That was in the 1950s in America. And obviously they got banned because they were too mature. So when, so like you come forward 30, 40 years to the 1980s, and Alan was so like starting to tell stories about real people with real problems, even if they were set in a superhuman genre. The idea is like he can make you and I think about what it might be like to have a relationship within that world. I think now we have to go back to Alan. He's the guy who made it all happen. I think the number of things I love about Killing Joke, Batman. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Batman. One of my sort of like he's the second favorite character in the whole world for me is Batman. The number one character I love most is Judge Dredd. I mean, I work on Judge Dredd regularly, still from the 1986 when I first did Watchmen and Killing Joke all the way up to today. But Batman is a character that, because there's a darkness to Batman, the thing that I love about Batman is that darkness. And same, you can say the same thing with Judge Dredd. There's a darkness. And the great thing that's sort of like, again, it's like it goes back to the way Alan writes things. I mean, just the title, Killing Joke, you know, it just sort of like, it's a positive negative or a negative positive. It's just, you have something that's just, you read the title, you suddenly think, well, I want to read what the Killing Joke's about. You want to like read what is so funny about how it ends, you know. And the great thing about good literature, great literature, is the fact that you can always debate what the writer, what the artist means. And that's the great thing about the Killing Joke, is there's so many things. Would it be able to be written today? I don't know. There's things in the Killing and Watchmen, I suppose you could say the same thing. I'm not totally sure it would be allowed to be written today. So the sort of subject matter, the stuff that we were doing in Watchmen and the Killing Joke, I don't know if it would be possible to do today. And one of the great things with working, for me, I've enjoyed working with DC. I've enjoyed the collaboration with the editors, you know, Karen Berger and it's like, you know, Shelley Bond and people like that. Definitely the people who went into Vertigo. I mean, Jeanette Kahn, who was the publisher at the time, they were doing adventurous stuff. They were trying stuff that could be different, that could be interesting. And it also went to the production of work as well. You know, you got the right artist, you got the right writer, you got the right colorist. And so like, when I started doing Killing Joke, I just finished Watchmen. I was going on to my own projects, something I would have either written and certainly something I would definitely have drawn and illustrated, probably painted and coloured, which I did actually in the end. I obviously did World Without End for DC Comics. So when they were trying to balance who would be colouring or who would, well, they definitely knew Alan Moore would be writing anything that he wanted to write for DC Comics. And Brian Bond is one of the best, artists to come out of the British Isles. So you get those two together, and it's exactly the same when you get Alan and Dave Gibbons together. You're making a match in heaven. And then it's just that sort of side of, who do we bring into that incredible combination? So luckily at that particular time I was riding a high, certainly after Watchmen. I think Watchmen and the success of Watchmen surprised so many people, certainly at DC and the mainstream comics across the board. So they asked me to come in and do the colouring on Killing Joke, mainly because I'd proven I could do, well, a good job, as I did on an award-winning job on Watchmen, as I received a number of awards for that, which I'm very, very proud of. And so they asked someone, myself, who is an award-winning colorist, to work with Alan Moore again, and obviously Brian Bolland. Brian, I think at that particular time as well, Batman was becoming really, really hot. I think the Tim Burton Batman movies were just starting to achieve a critical success. So they wanted to turn Batman the Killing Joke around a lot faster than Brian might have been able to do it. So I was asked to come in to do the colouring basically at the last moment. So I had to turn it around very, very fast. So when they did the Absolute Edition, I think it was last year, they gave me the opportunity to do an editorial explaining my position when it came to the colouring. And I think for me, working with Dave and Brian and Alan, it was just a pleasure in so many different levels. And if there's any controversy about the way Brian might have coloured it if he'd have had time, I think what we ended up getting was the edition that he did. So when we did the Absolute Edition of Killing Joke, we have Brian's colouring and then we have my colouring. And I think for me, the great thing about that, whatever controversy might have come out of that, was we end up getting the two examples. And the way I always approach it, I was looking at it from the madness of the Joker. And I know Brian, even at the time when we spoke about it, and he didn't really want to be too involved with what I was doing. I think he hoped I was going to be doing something close to what he wanted. But I came in from Watchmen. I knew colour could give a different emotional response to certain circumstances or certain storytelling aspects. And I think the thing that I did for me was the direct line from the colouring I did in Watchmen. So I was doing it colourful, exciting, vibrant, with banging heads of colour. It's the colours, the extreme yellows and oranges against purples and greens, and blues. And I was trying to depict almost an hallucinogenic aspect of what the madness of the Joker might give to the world of Batman. And I know Brian wanted to do it as the Dark Knight. He wanted to do it just dark and gritty and low key, should we say. So I want to do it as the madness of Joker. So controversy, I don't know. I'm very happy with what I did. I'm still happy with what I did.
¿Tuvieron algún problema con la censura por lo fuerte y explícito de la obra? Incluso una página del ataque sexual de Bárbara Gordon tuvo que ser cambiada.
I think, as I said slightly earlier, I think there's a number of things that we did in the mid-80s, early 90s, and probably up to the early 2000s that would not be written nowadays. I think so, like, when Vertigo first started, when Vertigo was starting to take adult themes and like reflect American society in particular, they spoke about the human spirit, they spoke about the human sensibilities, but it tended to be reflecting what was happening in America at that particular time. So there was a number of issues that was censored, editorial decisions were made not to sort of like tell certain stories that seemed to reflect what was happening in American society a little bit too closely. And I think a lot of the editors, because it was still mainstream comics and still is, DC is still mainstream comics publisher, they were sort of like concerned about certain aspects of storytelling that a lot of creators, that certainly the ones who worked for Vertigo when that started, they wanted to explore other avenues and all other elements of what made all of us human. You know, the human element, this like the relationship with people. And I think some of the creators, certainly the writers, I think to a certain extent, artists, as long as it's gone through the editorial process, to a certain extent, they've been given the go-ahead. But when the writers are like asked to do a certain project, asked to write a certain story, they can go off at tangents, they can sort of go all over the place, they can decide like they want to tell that aspect of the story or that aspect of the story. And I think once it ends up back with the editors, then they might suddenly think, hang on, I'm not totally sure about this, the way the subject matter is going, the direction. And that's a great thing about creativity. I have a problem with censorship. I have a problem with it getting past a certain stage in the creative process, and then people outside of the creative process start dictating or censoring aspects of the story we were trying to tell. I mean, writers in particular, because they're the guys who's like doing the nuts and bolts and the ideas and the, you know, the adventurous stuff and the visual stuff the artists do, but the writers are the ones who need to get the emotions and the relationship sorted out. And if they start taking going in a direction that's like, sometimes when it gets back to the editorial staff, they're being too adventurous, then that's, and particularly when you get people like big corporate clients, should we say, you know, the big businesses who need to sort of like be very political about what they're trying to like sell in, you know, the supermarkets or what movies are trying to make, then they're trying to like, to a certain extent, well, they're trying to play safe. There's no two ways about that. They're trying to play safe. So even though I have a problem with censorship, if you work within the mainstream publishing, if you're trying to reach a mainstream audience, then the editorial direction that we get can be restrictive. But once that's being produced and it's out in the shops, then I find people making censorial comments about something that a lot of intelligent people have made a decision about. I find censorship problematic. Yes.
Bien, se logró una teoría de que el Joker muere al final. Creo que fue Grant Morrison el que lo dijo. ¿Qué pensás o qué puedes decir de esto?
Well, I just love, I think we touched on it earlier, I just love the fact that like there's an ambiguity. And I think that's the great thing about such a brilliant writer. You know, he will give you alternatives. You can write, to a certain extent, your own ending. You know, I don't like stories that spoon feed you, you know, so this is the way it starts, this is the middle, this is the character, this is how it ends. I like ambiguity, you know, I like the fact that sort of like, you know, Rorschach, you know, he's mad, he's a psycho, he's a dangerous man, but at the very end of Watchmen, he is the one with the most integrity. He dies for his integrity. And I think the thing that Alan Moore for me got right was the fact that like the darkness in Gotham City, the darkness that sort of like Batman has within him. We know he started his Batman career as like a very tortured individual. And we certainly know that the Joker is definitely doing out. He's really out there. He's screwed up, and he's whatever created him. And Alan did touch on what created the madness of Joker. I like that ambiguity, the fact that they can actually talk at the end. They can actually have a conversation. There's a meeting between a mind and a mind. You know, and I think one of the great things about great literature, and I think Alan Moore would actually disagree, but I think The Killing Joke is great literature, great comics literature. And the great thing about great literature is the fact that it lets you, the reader, add something more. You bring yourself into the story. And I think that is one of the most satisfying things about the ending. Everyone else might think, why is it so ambiguous? You know, why are we reading different interpretations? But I love that. That's one of my favorite things about working with people like Alan Moore and Brian Bolland and Dave Gibbons.
Bien. Mundo sin fin es una crónica de la lucha, una crónica futurista de la lucha de sexos. Ahí te tocó trabajar con Jamie Delano. ¿Qué nos puedes decir de eso y de tu trabajo como dibujante ahí?
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's really interesting because at the moment we're talking to a number of Well Without End was one of those great things that I was given the opportunity to do after the success of Watchmen, The Killing Joke, and whatever else I'd done at that particular time. And like I was asked who I would like to work with, and Jamie Delano was asked who would like to work with, and we said each other. And so like I think we had done stuff before for 2000 AD and other publications, Marvel UK. So I knew Jamie, as I said earlier, like socially, one of the great things in the early days of like getting involved in comics was the fact that we can actually meet people face to face and talk to each other and so like come up with ideas. So Jamie was always on my radar. And the fact that it's like a mainstream publisher like DC would give me and Jamie the opportunity to tell something that's so satirically explosive, you know, the battle of the sexes. And again, so like going back to what I was saying about could we write a lot of the things that were written in the 80s and early 90s, I don't think we would be allowed to write that type of story now. I mean, it was a satirical look at the battle of the sexes, which exploded into a full-blown Armageddon of the sexes. And Jamie, again, like I write, I pencil, I ink, I colour. I'm an all-round, I know some people might say smart ass. I do everything. I'm a multi-talented jack of all trades, should we say. And when I sit down with a writer, someone who is a professional writer, like Jamie Delano, Alan Moore, Mark Miller, and some of the other great writers I've worked with, there's something about writers that's like I can't do. When I write a story, I write something that I want to draw. So first and foremost, what I try to do for me as a writer is sort of like, well, I want to see, I know, a man leaping over a building at a single bound. I want to see someone with a back cape on, so like swing from building to building and beating up bad guys. I want to do something visual. Whereas when you get writers who are thinking of ideas and emotions and feelings, when I work with someone like Jamie or Alan, they give me so much more to work with. I know what's happened behind people's lives. I know, so like there's a problem in the past, or I know, you know, this person isn't as strong as he looks. That person, she is a lot stronger than she looks. And that was a great thing about working with Jamie. It's like, was the fact that he created a world from the ground up. I mean, I know I did my visual interpretation of it, but he was the one who like gave me the words to create that world. So working with Jamie was just wonderful. And we are doing a Brazilian edition that's coming out in the end of this year. So like, I think July, August time. And we're doing an Italian edition, which is coming out June, July time as well. So World Without End, Jamie and I got the rights back because of Watchmen. They were giving creators different contracts, and you share in the royalties, you share in the, you know, it's your character. Watchmen is Dave and Alan's characters. That's their name is enshrined in history. That's their character. And it was the same with World Without End. And in one way, I'm really, really pleased that it wasn't as successful as Watchmen, because Jamie and I now still own the World Without End. Whereas Dave and Alan, you know, they might sort of own Watchmen, but they're never going to get it back, because DC will always find a way to exploit its richness and its vast history. If World Without End had been as successful as Watchmen, I would be very, very happy. I would be living in a castle somewhere in Scotland. I would be a wealthy man. I'm not sort of like saying that Alan and Dave want to be living in a castle in Scotland, but if I was that wealthy, I would probably be living in a castle in Scotland. But World Without End wasn't that successful, and that turned out really well for me and Jamie, because we own that character. We can do anything we want with it, but we haven't got that power behind us that DC have when it comes to exploiting something like Watchmen. So, yeah, very pleased that World Without End is still going, and Jamie and I are still getting a little bit of money.
Bien, ¿por qué crees que se produjo la invasión de autores ingleses en el cómic americano en los 80, que fue tan bien recibida, ¿no?, en Estados Unidos?
I think it was timing. I think if you look in so many different ways, I mean, I'm a huge fan of a black and white magazine, comic magazine, publishers called Warren Publishing, and they published Creepy and Eerie and 1984 and Blazing Combat and a couple of other books. And they used artists from all around the world. They tend to use American writers, but the artists from all around the world, from Argentina, from Brazil, from Spain, from Italy, from the UK. And artists, to a certain extent, they've been able to travel just because it's a visual medium. I think the written word has tended to be, obviously for the American market, it has to be based in English, Anglo-American English. Because a lot of British comics creators at that particular time were steeped in American culture, you know, in American literature and American comics in particular, we had the similar sensibilities, but because we weren't sort of like force-fed American comics from when we were growing up until we started working for them, I think a lot of British creators thought outside the American box. So we, British creators, we could obviously write and think and, well, we could draw in the same language, you know, everyone can draw in the same language because it's a visual medium. But the great thing at that particular time, more so because of the writing, there was a crossover between British writing and American writing. But because the Americans at that particular time, the writers, they were feeding on the same sort of like creative pool sort of thing. You know, it was like that sort of like the Danish vision of the world, you know, the god of like the giant snake circling the world, eating its own tail. I can't remember which god or demigod that was, but American writers at the time, except for the odd exception, they was like telling the same story that they read as young people, as children. Whereas when the British writers came into the American field, they were sort of like talking about all sorts of literature. You know, they were talking about George Orwell, they were talking about Shakespeare, they were talking about, you know, a million other influences. Whereas I personally, my personal opinion was the fact that a lot of American writers were writing what they'd already written or what they'd already read. So they were going to write what they loved. And there's nothing wrong with that to a certain extent, except it just self-defeats itself. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So when the British came and started writing in particular, obviously the artists followed on. But then, you know, to a certain extent, like, you know, any good artist can work in American comics, as has been proven over the years by being from all around the world. But I think for me, more than anything, it was the writers. They actually brought in fresh ways of doing the traditional American superhero. So as much as I hate to say it, we need to blame the writers.
Perfecto. ¿Estás trabajando en unos proyectos?
I need to look at I'm going to drink some
Absolutely.
wine, and I'm talking too much. Argentinian wine. Yep. Can you see that? Salud.
Salud.
At the moment, World Without End is being produced around the world, so I'm doing sort of like relatively new stuff. I actually did speak to Jamie Delano, the writer of World Without End, over the last couple of months, because the Brazilian edition are doing some really interesting things with it. So I did ask Jamie if he would like to write a new short story for World Without End. Whether or not he will, I don't know, but I would like to revisit it. New stuff, I'm being very happily employed to do stuff for 2000 AD still, which if you'd told me in 1986 I'd still be working, or 1984, I'd still be working for 2000 AD and 2024, I wouldn't have believed you. I would not have believed you. So I'm still doing stuff for 2000 AD, which I'm very, very happy about, because the great thing is the writers are still coming up with fresh ideas. The creators of sort of like Judge Dredd in particular, you know, it's like they set such a brilliant template. It was, you know, people can grow and people can tell wild stories and still be original. That's a great thing about, for me, science fiction. That's what I love about science fiction. I'm trying to think of any new projects I'm doing personally. No, I always think I definitely want to do my own character, which is Razorjack, which has been reprinted a number of times. And I created that at the end of the 90s, early 2000s. And I was doing my own characters. And the thing that I'm very, very pleased about that, it's been reprinted a couple of times over the years, but also my character Razorjack appeared with Judge Dredd, which, as I said earlier, was my #1 favorite character. So a number of things are bubbling under, and I'm really, really pleased about things. And sometimes writers will talk to me about new projects that I can't talk about, just in case they either don't come off, and then I feel I've made it unlucky by talking about it. And then sometimes I feel, the non-disclosure clause sort of thing. I sometimes feel I can't talk about things either. So there are a number of things happening, but a lot of it is just mainstream publication. And I just did a Batman story which I wrote for Black and White Batman, Brave and Bold. I think this is a very strong wine. I'm starting to slur a bit, but I did a Black and White Brave and Bold Batman story. I wrote and illustrated it with my fellow collaborator Sally Jane Hurst, who we work together. She's my wife, and we do lots of things together. And so a number of things are bubbling under. But I would like to do another Batman in the future. So hopefully, if you send this to the DC editors who do the Batman comic, I'll do another Batman. But other than that, I'm just happily working away and paying the bills. Thank you so much.
¿Hay algún autor argentino, algún cómic argentino que te guste?
I know some great artists, and whenever they've been in European publications, I will definitely know of the work. I mean, it's like some of the great Artinian artists that have translated into American or into, Dark Horses, I know, produces a lot of alternative comics from around the world. But the names would not spring to mind immediately. But I definitely know there's a great crossover with Argentinian, Spanish, Italian, Brazilian, South American artists. I daren't mention names in case it's a Brazilian artist or an Italian artist or a Spanish artist. So I'm sure I know many, many Artinian artists and writers, but to try and remember which brilliant artist it is, I find it very, very hard.
Bien, bueno, la última. ¿Te sigues hablando con Alan, con Dave, con Brian? ¿Qué piensan de todo esto que lograron a nivel mundial con estos cómics como Watch Me, The Killing? ¿Qué es lo que les quedó? ¿Qué piensan de todo lo que se generó, algo tan grande, digamos, que no, ya te digo que es a nivel mundial?
I think, I am still in touch with Dave Gibbons in particular. I mean, we've done a lot of work together post Watchmen. I probably saw Alan Moore about 4 or 5 years ago. But when we're young, we're all of us socially like that. But obviously, distraction, success, family, world, position wherever you are in the world takes you apart from each other. But Dave Gibbons I see quite regularly. But we were actually very, very lucky in the United Kingdom because we do conventions, and because it's such a small area, you do tend to find the artists and writers tend to go to the same conventions regularly. So I will see Dave in particular. Alan does, as you know, he wants nothing to do with comics anymore. He will not go to comic conventions. I think the last comic convention he went to was in 1989, So unless you arrange to meet Alan, then I think we won't be able to. No, I haven't seen Alan, I'd say, for about 4 or 5 years. Dave, I do see quite regularly, and he's still as funny and is still entertaining and is still creative as he always is. I saw Brian Bolland last year, and I do tend to see people quite regularly because what we do is such an international acknowledged art form sort of thing, so wherever I go in the world, one of the things that always makes me laugh, if I do a signing in one country, 1 week, Dave Gibbons would have done a signing the previous week in the same country, and a fan would bring me a book of Watchmen and Dave signed it the week before, and then I'll sign it the week after. Funny enough, very few new Watchmen have Alan Moore's signature in it. That's one of those things. But yeah, we do keep in touch and we do meet socially, and I feel blessed to have been involved with Watchmen and Batman: The Killing Joke, and to have made such wonderful friends and creative friends all these years. So yeah, I'm very pleased.
Bueno, ¿algún mensaje que le quieras mandar a tus fans argentinos?
I'm just really pleased to thank you for Nicholas and Walter for giving me the opportunity to speak to you and speak to the people who appreciate and love what I do, and to be involved, as you said, it's like with something like Watchmen in particular, this like just touches people all around the world. I'm very happy and very gratified, and thank you, Argentina. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Gracias, John. Personalmente te quería agradecer. Somos muy fan de tu trabajo, respetamos tu trabajo. Y acá en Argentina todos somos del team John Higgins, porque acá incluso la gente se enojó cuando le cambiaron el color a The Killing Joke, así que te quiero agradecer esto de corazón, la verdad.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Some really nice questions. Thank you very much.
Gracias, John.